Good afternoon. So welcome to this very special panel celebrating and reflecting on 10 years of the Madeleine Albright Class of '59 Institute for Global Affairs at Wellesley College. And it is so wonderful to see so many of you here. Since its founding, the Institute has sought to address many of the most pressing issues of our time, and to do so in a unique setting with a multidisciplinary approach. Central to its mission is the belief that the surest way to bring positive change to our fast-moving, complex world is through educating women and advancing women's leadership in all of its forms. And when you look around us, the built environment, the lived experience of a Wellesley education so supports this vision. I want you to think about it. The campus is one of the few places on earth where the buildings, the quads, the programs, they all bear the names of women. Our outstanding faculty is over 50% women, and this includes in some of the most male-dominated fields, such as economics, philosophy, and computer science. And of course, our alumni network that so deeply loves and supports the college is frequently referred to as the most powerful women's network in the world. So the Albright Institute and its mission to foster the next generation of women leaders in global affairs embodies Wellesley's deep commitment to civic participation. In fact, Wellesley is at the forefront of a national trend in increased voter participation amongst college students. A recent Tufts University study found that in 2018, in the midterm elections, Wellesley students voted at a rate 13% higher than the institutional average, a testament to the college's civic engagement, which the Albright Institute encourages and exemplifies. The fellows that the Institute produces are extraordinary. I have met so many of them, and they are inspiring, they're talented, they're hopeful. They speak of their experiences in the program as transformational. They exemplify the philosophy that grounds every aspect of the Institute, that global leadership is not merely about individuals, but demands global collaboration. Through group work, team building, and public presentations to policy leaders, they develop the skills necessary to work across difference, to build bridges, and to lead on the most pressing issues of our time, including climate change, threats to democracy, economic development, and arms proliferation. Their work reinforces Wellesley's core values and exemplifies its motto, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. There is no better champion of this signature program at Wellesley than Secretary Albright herself. She has been fully invested from the start to create and foster this important effort through the priceless gift of her precious time, personal experience, and unwavering support. I am particularly honored to share the news of Secretary Albright's $1 million commitment to the Madeleine Albright Institute for Global Affairs Endowed Fund. Her investment in the legacy she created will help to ensure the continued success of the Albright Institute for many decades to come and further Wellesley's tradition of leadership on an international stage. Today, in no small part to initiatives like the Albright Institute, we are proud to be recognized both as a premier college for women and increasingly as a global center for women's leadership. To bring change by being the change, this is the Wellesley effect at its most powerful. For 10 years, the Albright Institute has done exactly that. I look forward to all that is to come. Secretary Albright, at this 10th anniversary, we thank you for your dedication to the future of our students and to Wellesley College, and most importantly, to the world. So now I'd like to turn it over to Joseph Joyce, the M. Margaret Ball Professor of International Relations and Professor of Economics. Professor Joyce.
Good morning. I'm so proud to be here. I am indeed a professor of economics, but today we're going to talk about the Albright Institute. So let me first point out that the Institute is one of many outstanding programs on this campus that allow our students ways to flourish outside the classroom. The reason we're talking about the Institute, you just learned, is that this year is a bit special for us. It's the 10th year. Let me give you a very brief overview of what the Institute actually is all about. We choose 40 women, 40 juniors and seniors, through a competitive admission process who are named Albright Fellows. They come together for 3 weeks in January, in the dead of winter, when the campus is very quiet. And during the first 2 weeks, they hear presentations by our faculty, policy professionals, including many outstanding alumni, about the leading issues of the day. Climate change, technology, refugees, almost anything you can think of, we've had someone in the Institute to talk about. That's the first 2 weeks. During the evenings, we know they get together and talk about what they heard during the day. And in some ways, what happens in those evenings is almost more important than what we do during the day. So it's a very intense experience. Then in the third week, the students are divided into groups of 5, and we try very hard to have the groups differ. And they do presentations on some global issue that we chose. The very first year, for example, in 2010, we talked about the Millennium Development Goals. Those presentations are done in front of a distinguished visiting professor. Many years that's been Madeleine Albright herself. So Madeleine comes to campus during the third week and meets with the students in many sessions, listens to their presentations and gives feedback. And for these women to have that opportunity to literally make a presentation on an important issue to someone like Madeleine Albright, and then to have a dialogue about that issue, and to have her respond, and she responds in terms of telling them things they might not have realized or things they got right, but it's a dialogue, and that means so much to these women. That's the third week during the Institute in January. Then we end, but the Institute isn't quite over, because each student then will have an internship during the following summer. So it's a 2-part program, 3 weeks in January and then the following summer. In choosing the fellows, we work very hard to have a diverse group, diverse in terms of nationality, ethnicity, religion, whatever, okay? We want 40 strong women who represent the very best of Wellesley. And these women, since 2010, have been leaving the Institute and going on to do many wonderful things, and we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning with 3 of them. We've handed out brief biographies of the women who are speaking, including obviously Madeleine Albright herself. We could obviously say a lot about Madeleine, but since you have the biography in front of you, I'm not going to repeat everything. Simply to point out that she was the first woman to be Secretary of State and left that post in 2000. And since then has been equally active. She's had a very active career in the last 2 decades. Among other things, she chairs the National Democracy Institute in Washington. She has a global strategy group called Albright Stonebridge. She's a professor at Georgetown University, and she's a very active author. A year ago, a book of hers was published, Fascism: A Warning, which got very wide reviews and was very widely noted and commented on. This coming year, she told me, she has a new book about to come out called Hell and Other Destinations, and I'm looking forward to seeing the new book. So that is what she's been up to. In addition, as I said, she comes to campus every January and spends time with our students. And those interactions of Madeleine and the students are clearly something that they'll always remember. Her generosity at this institute has been tremendous. You heard about the gift. I will tell you also about her time. She is here when we need her and helps us so much in actually running the institute. So I'm very proud to have had the chance to work with Madeleine Albright in doing the institute, and I'm very eager for you to hear from her and from the other fellows. So join me please in welcoming to the stage Madeleine Albright and the Albright Fellows. Madeleine, I'd like to start off with a question for you, if I could. So as a graduate of this institution, you are very well aware of its outstanding academic programs. And yet, 11 years ago, when the college approached you about doing something in honor of your 50th reunion, you said you wanted a program for the students. What was on your mind?
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words, and thank you all for being here. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the Albright Fellows. Let me just say, I did love being here, and I learned an awful lot, and my whole life would have been different if I hadn't gone to Wellesley. And so I'm very, very grateful for everything I learned here. But I do think, from my own experience of having kind of climbed my way up the ladder in Washington, there were certain things that I wish I had learned better in terms of really understanding how people from various disciplines need to work together to get something done. The importance of being able to summarize things in a way that are understandable, to be able to give public presentations, and to work in teams. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to build on the incredible education that people get at Wellesley and continue to get at Wellesley, but prepare more women for global leadership? I can state it's not easy for women in global leadership. Certainly hasn't been and will continue to be difficult. And I do think the point was to get some kind of skills that would be useful in terms of the kinds of things that need to happen when you leave college. And one of the other parts, and I hope we can stress this more, is women are very good at making friends. They're not very good at networking. Men are not very good at making friends, but they are good at networking. Other than that, I have no views. But I do think that what is important is not only the kind of friendships and networking that one does while in college, but to continue it. And so it's really my hope, and I'm seeing this, is that as the Albright Fellows start marching out in the world, that you will all work together.
So I do have more questions for the Secretary, but I wonder how I could turn to the Fellows. Halima, you are now at Cambridge University, but you were in the very first class of the Albright Institute. My question for you and for the other women is, what do you remember? Were there any particular talks or interactions? When you think back 10 years ago, what pops into your mind?
Oh yes, so many instances and moments. I'm so happy to be back, actually. That's the first thing I would like to say. It's always a pleasure to be back at Wellesley because I love Wellesley. And this is where I became who I had always wanted to be, at least set the foundation for who I'd wanted to be. I think with regards to the Albright Institute, it started getting intense on the very first day. So two of my really good friends were also part of the Institute, and we kept some sort of journal, so we would reflect on a daily basis. And I read the email yesterday, and they have used the word intense 5 times. And I think for me, the first morning, the 2 sessions were particularly important because I drew good lessons out of them. The first session, if I recall, was on global ethics and social justice. And there were conversations around poverty, some of which that made me uncomfortable because I felt things needed to be said in a way that was a bit more nuanced. I didn't speak up. The second session, something similar happened and they spoke. And the fact that I did actually change the conversation. I think it added value and it allowed other people to also do the same. And I think it is so important that we speak up, especially when we feel uncomfortable, because that is probably when it matters the most. So that was, I think, for me, a key moment, and that is what I tried to do. I think to speak about, if there's one thing I took out of the Albright Institute, there were many, but that push to just say what I think in moments where I feel maybe I shouldn't, it has been something that I've gotten out of the Albright Institute, and I'm so glad it did happen.
Esther, you were 2 years later in the Institute, and you went on to get a graduate degree at Georgetown, and you're now working at an NGO that deals with Korea. I wonder what your recollections are from about 2012.
The The lecture that I remember the most actually was a lecture given by Professor Rosenwald on whether there is a role for imaginative poets, writers, artists at the table, and whether they have authority to speak on global affairs. And I think this struck me so much because I was so steeped I was an international relations political science major, and so the opportunity to hear a different perspective on global affairs was really wonderful. And I think it was great because he argued that artists and poets help us imagine the world as we hope it to be. And so many of the challenges that we were tackling at the Institute, mine was mobilizing the political will to assist victims of natural disasters, which is such a big issue. And I think all of us, we were so overwhelmed. How do we fix something like this? But that talk reinforced to me that it's important to have an imagination for where we're going. And recently a political candidate had given this quote, "Dream big and fight hard," and I think his talk reminded me that these issues are certainly very hard and seemingly irreconcilable, but that those big goals are helping us achieve what the Institute set out to do.
Zsofia, you were also of that group in 2012, and now you're an artist, and you're living in London, and your work is getting better known. What affected you? What do you remember from the Institute?
Yeah, thank you. So I arrived at Wellesley thinking I would major in poli-sci or international relations, but ended up taking no class in the department, and quickly became a literature and studio art double major. And when the Institute started, I thought, wow, what a great opportunity I get to now. I'm invited to apply to something where I, as an art major, humanities major, get to also participate or have a say or learn from both the faculty and my peers. So that was a really big deal for me, and I just remember writing my application and saying, why it's a valid choice to become an artist, and what can I contribute still to both Wellesley and my native Hungary and whichever country I will end up living in. So I do have a specific memory, one of those snapshot memories coming out of the first session, I think, and turning to a friend and being like, wow, we get to do this. Yeah.
Madeleine, I know that there are other former secretaries of state who have institutes. There's James Baker, who has an institute, I believe, at Rice, and Colin Powell, whose institute, I believe, is at the City University of New York. I suspect you guys get together once in a while and have conversations about what you're up to. Tell me what's said about the institutes.
Well, first of all, it's thanks to your thoughts about the Institute and getting it started that allows me to say mine is the best. We do actually get together, and we do talk about what institute does what, and that we ought to do more things together. John Kerry has an institute at Yale now also, and so I think people are thinking about the next generation. We also do say that we did a better job than the other guy. It's a fairly competitive group, and so, but I do think that the similarity in terms of thinking about the importance of the next generation and trying to really make clear the things that we're missing, the things that need to be done, and I think actually it would be interesting to do some exchanges back and forth in terms of how people see leadership, especially, frankly, with Colin Powell, who's a very good friend and who has dedicated an awful lot of his post-secretarial life and post-military life to education. And so he's got a lot of different ideas. But Joe, truly, I think you were the reason that we were able to look at an overall set of subjects that then could be parsed in a way that different students could present and then work in groups. And that group work and the speaking, clarifying what people think, and then the multilateral. Part of thing, I'd say this all the time when I speak to every audience, which is, I say I went to Wellesley at some time between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. And so things were a little bit different. I did major in political science. I did take a lot of history, and it was very hard to kind of get out of the lane. I did take art history. I could only remember what car was in front of what cathedral. But I do think that having the multidisciplinary aspect of this is so important.
I will tell you that when we were planning the Institute in 2009, I knew the importance of religion to you, and that was certainly something that we included in the Institute from the very beginning. So we very much responded to your interest in planning what we would do in the Institute. Halimatou, let me ask you a question. So here you are doing your work in Cambridge and have been very interested in development work. What skills did you learn, or what things did we do in the Institute that really had an impact upon what you're doing today?
Again, so much. I think if there was something extremely valuable about the Institute work was the fact that it brought together people from different fields together on the same table to think about that one problem. And I think my year, we focused on the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and we were the first group to give a presentation. And I remember after we were done, Secretary Albright, you lowered your glasses like this, and I thought, we are finished. And really, we were finished, but in a good way. You've really challenged us to think about what some of the practical implications of the things we talked about would be. What would it mean for, say, a farmer in Niger, where I'm from? What would it mean for communities? And I think the ability to ask questions and to ask different questions is something that I've taken with me, because after the Albright Institute, I was in Washington, D.C. for just 4 months. It was very good work, but I vividly actually remember one day asking myself, is this my idea of making a difference in the world? Because as an intern, I ended up just doing a lot of administrative stuff, and for me, the world was waiting. I knew always that development was what I was interested in. And working at the Institute and seeing so many brilliant women doing things in the world, I asked myself, is there a way for me to be able to do the same, or at least to learn? So I quit my internship and I went home to Niger. And what was supposed to be a 3-month journey ended up being some of the most transformative 2 years of my life, working in villages on girls' education, child marriage, just really learning. And a lot of the skills that I've learned at the Institute, taking different perspectives from different people, asking questions, especially that was something that I took with me, whether at a table with policy makers or under, like on a mat with women in rural Niger.
Esther, you work in a part of the world that certainly has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, Korea. In your work, when you look back, what stayed with you from the Institute that, in a sense, affected how you deal with those issues?
I think the design of the groups really prepared me for what I do now in my work. Having a group of peers who, in my group, we had a student who was studying architecture, one student who was studying public health, and then 2 students doing political science to tackle this issue of how do we address and assist victims of natural disaster. And I think what I took away most from that experience is, it boils down to burden sharing and partnerships, that we can't do it alone, that we have to have a range of perspectives to have a good solution. And in my work now, I work at an NGO that is membership-based, of 90 members who support improving relations between the United States and North Korea. And you have to have everybody. You have to have scientists, you have to have humanitarians, you have to have academics, historians, and the policy people too. And it's just reinforced in my mind how wonderful it is to have these partnerships. And it makes, I think, our mission much stronger to have that diversity and that kind of multidisciplinary approach.
Zsofia, I was glad that you mentioned Professor Rosenwald, because having a member of the humanities during the very opening of the Institute was important to us in trying to show how we're multidisciplinary. What stays with you in terms of your work as an artist when you think about the Institute?
I was also going to talk about the importance of groups and it being a multidisciplinary group project that we all have to work on. And I think one of the biggest values of that setting, and that's true for Wellesley as well, where we interact with different majors in our dorms or in our sports teams or dining halls and at the Institute, is how do you talk about the same issues that affect us both when you don't necessarily share the same expertise, you don't necessarily know the same vocabulary, but how do you come to a common language? And that's been really important and really useful to me in my work as an artist. Of course, art, I make paintings, which has the privilege of being able to be accessed without language, in any language, anywhere in the world. But when I have to talk about it, I have to make sure I explain or present my work in a way that someone who's never looked at art before can still enjoy it or get something out of it, as well as someone who's an expert.
Madeleine, I know in your travels you often meet alumni who were Albright Fellows, and I'm curious to know, do you see a common characteristic in them?
Well, I do, and I do think that it is the idea that you can make a difference and see the value of what you're doing and really kind of have a sense that you can learn from what you're already doing. And I think that's a part that is kind of constant learning, because I think that what has happened as a result of Wellesley and the Institute is the importance of kind of keeping up with everything. But by the way, I think one of the things as I listen here is that, and I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that I wanted to see an institute that actually did have this kind of group concept was what I saw lacking in Washington, which was there is a tendency in Washington when there are a number of people briefing the secretary or whomever, is to make the person that is briefing with you look stupider than you are. And so it's not helpful. And kind of not understanding that a group approach to something is something that strengthens everybody and the multidisciplinary part of it. And so not kind of compete to say I'm the smartest person in this group, but I want to see what we get out of working with each other. And that is something that when I see some of the fellows abroad, I think there is that sense that we have learned that we need to work together, and people talk about the people that they've worked with. So yes, one does see it.
President Johnson mentioned the network of fellows now that they've been leaving Wellesley. So Halima, I'm curious, do you keep in contact with any of the women you met 10 years ago?
Yes, I do, but I wish I'd kept stronger contacts, but I definitely do keep in touch with some of the fellows. There is another fellow who's also at Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, doing some work in business. So yes, I do.
Esther, since you're in Washington, I'm going to guess that you actually do come across a fair number of fellows.
Yes, there is a very strong Albright contingent in DC. So it's really, Chris in there as well. Yeah, it's actually been really wonderful. My year, especially 2012, we had a really, across actually Albright years, Albright Institute years, a really great network, and they've become some of my closest friends in DC. And also they've been actually very wonderful professional contacts as well. I'd like to shout out to Rebecca Turkington, who was I believe a 2011 Albright Institute Fellow. And I was putting together a working group, or helping to put a working group together on helping an organization who was thinking about how can we put together an organization that focuses on menstrual health and sexual harassment training in the workplace in North Korea. And certainly, I understand the North Korea part of it really well, but I do not have that kind of gender and development background. And so I had reached out to Rebecca, who is an expert in this. She's the assistant director at the Council of Foreign Relations in the Women in Foreign Policy program. And she was wonderful. I asked Rebecca, who do I need to talk to? And she gave me an incredible list of people from high level to mid level to low level, their email addresses, and offered to put me in contact with any of these women. And so it really made our working group that much stronger. And the Albright Institute was having that network through the Albright Institute was pivotal.
Zsofia, you're based in London, and I know there are many enthusiastic Wellesley alums on the continent and in London. In fact, Madeleine Albright and the Institute went to visit London one year. She gave a fabulous speech at the London School of Economics. In your travels in London, do you come across other fellows?
Definitely. There is a fair number of fellows in London, and we do get a chance to meet at the UK Club's events, which it's quite an active club. What I do find is that whenever we meet with a fellow, even within a larger Wellesley event, that shared experience helps us connect right away, so we can talk about our experiences warmly and fondly. But in general as well, Wellesley and the friendships I've made on the campus have accompanied me, and I'm sure they will accompany me throughout life, as we can see from Secretary Albright's example of always mentioning her friends from Wellesley. I hope that will be me as well in some years.
Madeleine, I thought it would be only fair to give you a chance to ask a question of the three women next to you.
Well, I think that the question that I would like to get at is how we actually make sure the network is expanding, and how exactly, Esther, you were talking about reaching out. Washington is easier. And so the question is how we can work on the networking aspect part. And then also, I know we're going to keep talking about this during the day, but how do you think that your experience has prepared you for a very changed world? How will you take the skills that you learned and that you're practicing now that will take you into a very different international situation? Yes?
No, go ahead.
Secretary Albright, at the end of our institute, you had a lecture with Mr. Wolfenson on Is the UN Dead? And I was really struck by this presentation because you made a forceful argument that we can't deal with the many issues that we're facing in this world alone. We have to come together and work through multilateral institutions, and I do think that still rings true today. I mean, the issues that we're facing, like climate change, the global migration crisis, there's nearly 70 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, and that is not something that we can go it alone at. And we have to, I think, rebuild multilateral institutions and rebuild our alliances and rebuild coalitions. And I think the Institute certainly prepares you for that we are now a coalition of 400 women, and we're stronger for that, and I hope that we can work on these goals together.
I think for me, one point I would like to speak to is the necessity to keep broadening our worlds and our perspectives, especially today, where it's very easy to live in your own bubble, whether be it online or even in the real world or in the kind of communities that we engage with. It's very easy to surround yourself with people that think the way you think. But I think what the Albright Institute has challenged me to do was to surround myself with people who might think differently from the way I do. And as I look at the kind of challenges and opportunities that the world faces, it's critical that we not only do that, but we actively seek to do that and make that the norm. How do we move forward knowing that our views can be challenged? Our views might not necessarily be what they should be. And for me, speaking as an African woman, looking at the African continent, I'm very optimistic, and I also see the point that narratives need to change, and narratives would only change if, again, just speaking up happens, and that speaking up sometimes does impact how you engage with other people. I don't know if I'm making the point very clearly, but a lot of times African countries, I think, had been portrayed in a particular way or in a specific way, and Africa has changed as a continent. So, yeah.
I graduated in 2012, but even in these 7-8 years almost, I've really enjoyed how strong the Wellesley alumni community is, and the fact that we get really, really excited to see each other and to make a point of seeing each other, or even just get really excited when you see someone wearing a Wellesley sweater. And I really enjoyed being back here 3 years ago on the invitation of the Institute when a lot of us came back for an anniversary. I forget now what it was, 5th perhaps. And that allowed us to just remember how privileged we were, both to come to Wellesley and to be able to participate in the Institute. So I think these reminders are important when we get lost in our daily lives and responsibilities. And I've really appreciated the chance.
So before I pose the last question, could I point out that I had the honor of being the first faculty director and served in that role for 7 years, and then thought it important to have another head articulate a different vision. So I was delighted when I was followed by Professor Takis Matakis of the Computer Science Department, who's here in the front row. And he had a fabulous run for 3 years in that position. He ended his 3rd year, and the new and current director, faculty director of the Institute, Professor Stacy Goddard of the Political Science Department. Stacy and Takis would like to rise and just say hello to everybody. My hope is that there'll be a long line of distinguished faculty stepping up and taking over the Institute and constantly giving it new energy, new ideas, and new direction. Speaking of new direction, Madeleine, it's been 10 years since we started the Institute, and the last couple of years in particular have been rather tumultuous in terms of international politics. When you think about what you wanted from the Institute then, would you annotate it anyway now? Would you change it, modify it?
Well, I do think that, has it really been tumultuous? I think that the thing that I would push on even more is the business of being prepared for the unexpected, which is why the questioning, for instance, and looking at really pushing on the unintended consequences of the suggestions that have been made, and really pushing the students to think in a whole other level of what artificial intelligence is going to be like, and basically looking more, solidifying the skills that are being developed, and at the same time trying to figure out how the skills will in fact be attributable or workable in a totally different environment. And that I do think we have all been working in terms of a system that had a lot to do, but mostly that there were various institutions that were capable of dealing with it. And I think the new classes are going to have to deal with the things that are completely unexpected, and at the same time see how the skill set can be adjusted to do that. Because I do think it's tumultuous now, but it's nothing like what it's going to be, and I think that we need to be ready for that, and there's no better group than Wellesley women to lead.
So the Institute has had a great 10-year run. I'm just really excited about the next 10 years. I hope you are too. Thank you very much.